I'm glad to see we are doing better than ever. The AAFCYRs are alive and well thanks to the work of many people who I had the pleasure of working with and new ones brought on board. If you guys didn't get to know me before, my name is Victoria Stissar Churchill. I am proud journalist, but proud conservative. I studied journalism in college, then I went on to work campaigns, realized that all politicians are assholes. Sorry for anybody that works for some, but they're all self-interested assholes, and so I decided that my hard work of 16, 17, 18-hour days that this business requires was better spent on myself and maximizing the impact that I could have, because as we know, in politics, lots of times we can only control what we can control, and we can't control a lot of other things, and so after doing that for 3 or 4 campaign cycles, I decided to go back into journalism, which is, like I said, what I studied in college. But, I wanted to do it my own way, so 2.5 years before I went to the New York Post, I worked for a conservative media startup based out of Reston, Virginia. Evolution Digital Media was the firm, and then we ran publications called American Liberty News and the Republican Standard here in Virginia. So I got to, through that, become kind of an expert in Virginia politics, and because in Virginia we have elections every year, we get the pleasure of working multiple campaign cycles, working with different candidates, consultants, etc. And, kind of as I always saw my mission is, like, for me, I always care about public service. That's, I think, why we're all here, is because we care about the future of this nation. And for us, I think the very important thing is we always want to see how we can maximize our impact. And so for me, I always knew it was about asking questions. It was about having conversations. How many of you guys have gone door knocking here? Woo! All right. I love it. That number keeps getting bigger and bigger every time. When you're door knocking, you go off and you have a conversation, and maybe if you're actually able to have a conversation, right, like you're not just working through the survey, you actually have a chance to change somebody's mind. The kind of door knocking we do here in Virginia, and if you guys went on deployments, you're probably knocking swing voters, targeted districts, et cetera. And so, through that exercise, we can change a voter's opinion here and there. But I know a lot of the times you go out and you may only talk to 3 or 4 or 5 people in a day, right? You can be out there for hours and hours and hours, and then you can say, well, maybe I changed that one voter's mind here and there, but, was it really worth my time, right? And so I went from having that experience, which I think is a large part of the skills that I bring with me to journalism, saying, that impact is great, and, like, I worked a campaign in 2018, which is actually where I met my husband, where we had a Republican who was running in a 6-way primary. We won the primary election by the margin that we narrowed down right to the number of positive IDs that we got at the door. So those conversations are impactful, but to me, again, I'm always looking to see how I can maximize my impact, right? So I went from that to saying, you know what, I'm going to work for a number of publications, including the Republican Standard here in Virginia. TRS has an audience of about 30 to 40,000. Obviously, we don't hit those people every day, but going from 3 or 4 voters in a day to 30 or 40,000, I was like, checkmate, like, here's my chance to maximize my impact. And then doing that 2.5 years, we grew that publication and others that I was a part of, and we wanted to go back, and, for me, obviously I want to grow and develop in my career, but again, my next question is, how can I make an impact? And so when the opportunity came to apply to work for the New York Post, I wanted to absolutely jump at it because, as much as I love the brand, I was like, well, I'm never going to work there. There's no way I'm ever going to move to New York. It's probably about the size of a big city that I ever want to live in. And so when the opportunity came to work for them and associate myself with their name and their brand and their history, which, if you guys don't know, the New York Post has been around since, I believe, 1801. It was started by Alexander Hamilton. I wrote the Federalist Papers, and this publication has been around since then. So to be a part of the historic story that the New York Post tells, I knew that was an opportunity that I had to jump on. And, of course, you see these jobs on LinkedIn, right? And they say, 50 people have applied, and then you check back the next day, and it's 150 people have applied, and then you check back the next day, and it's 1,000 people have applied, and I'm like, there's no fucking way these people are going to hire me. So fast forward a couple of weeks, another conversation I love having is always tell people, and I'm sure as all of you guys know, working in politics, is your network is your net worth, right? I'm now on my, I think, like 6th job in the politics and public policy space in about the last 7 or 8 years. I've gotten every single one of those jobs through a personal connection. So if any of you guys are new to the area, that's the way that you move ahead and about a year and a half ago when I was thinking about where I wanted my career to be, I wasn't really sure, I was pretty happy with what I was doing. I was a little bit content, a little bit complacent in a way, I think, as we do when we get into the day-to-day swing of a job. And I'm like, I don't know exactly what I want to do next, but I want my name to be brought up in the room where there's opportunities, and I want to place myself to where I'm top of mind when opportunities come up. I didn't know what that opportunity was going to be. And so to me, like, this was that opportunity. And so, like I said, that's a whole other conversation we can get into, but I think that just goes to show, like, it's about to be Christmas party season, right? Like, use that as an opportunity to reconnect with people. One of the things that I've done since my time at the New York Post is wrapping up is I've launched a Substack, so you guys can all follow me, freedomshots.substack.com. I'm going to be sharing lots of things about the media, about politics, but also about personal branding and things like that I'm very passionate about. So quick plug for that, but like I said, I knew that when the opportunity came up, I knew that I wanted to have that opportunity. And I think a large part of the way that I was able to do that was not only through my network, but also through my personal brand and through things like that. So fast forward, it's the middle of May. I knew I was going to be leaving town for about a week and a half because I went to go watch my sister graduate high school. Very exciting. She's actually here in Virginia. Very excited that she is in the Commonwealth. She's a lot smarter than me. She's an engineering student. But like, part of the reason why I'm here today is because I have the gift of gab, which is what I bring to the family dinner table and the Thanksgiving table. But I knew I was going to be taking time, and for me, my parents live all the way on the West Coast, in the Seattle area, and so for me, whenever I go home is always a time to reflect and recharge. And so actually, by the time that I got on the plane, I'd accepted the job, and I was actually starting remotely my first week because I was home. Well, I mean, this whole job was remote, but I was like 3 hours behind, in a different time zone, and I was onboarding, and it was hilarious because this team that I was a part of, the swing state team, I was one of 9 reporters from all across the country, and so I had colleagues in Arizona and Nevada who are actually on the same time zone as me. And so we were all complaining about the fact that onboarding started at 9 in the morning on the East Coast, which then for us it was 6 in the morning on the West Coast. So fast forward, that's my first week on the job, is I'm learning the ins and outs of this historic institution, which is the New York Post, and I'm learning about this job that has been created specifically for the election to, as I've kind of in hindsight, I've been looking backward and saying, really I think where we were able to make a difference, make an impact, is to balance out or even slightly favor coverage. I mean, some people might say towards Trump, towards conservatives, but to me it's towards common sense, in swing states. And so that's not only work that I personally did, where I covered the campaign not only for Trump, but for down ballot races in Pennsylvania, Virginia, which I still believe is a swing state, and North Carolina. And then, like I said, I had colleagues all across the country. I had, again, kind of going to the importance of having your personal brand. My colleague in Arizona was working for us at the same time that he was working for the Center Square, and he is the only center-right, right-of-center reporter in the entire state. Which is, like, when the New York Post came to hire him, they knew that this was the guy that they were going to get. They ended up getting him, part-time, ended up being more full-time, and literally as soon as his time ended, he's already back reporting for the Center Square. So that's, like, what I think another testament of how important building your brand and things like that are. Another great colleague I had in Michigan, his name is James Dixon. He used to work for the Detroit News for 20 years. I don't know how he survived. He's actually going to be an upcoming guest on my podcast, so another quick plug. Check that out. That's going to be through my Substack. But he is also the only center-right reporter in the entire state of Michigan who, as he and I have had like offline conversations about this, the way that the media works in Detroit is you have the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press. They sit in the same building in Detroit, and they cover the entire state of Michigan. And so my colleague James is the only one that did not drink the Michigan media Kool-Aid of Jocelyn Benson, Gretchen Whitmer, and Elisa Slotkin. And he was the only one that was reporting on everything horrible that they were doing, that Elisa Slotkin allegedly owns a farm in Michigan, but she actually lives in D.C., and she's like totally not connected to anybody in Michigan. With Jocelyn Benson, who was the Secretary of State, he coined this name for her, which I absolutely love, called Election Barbie, and that was the one that stuck. But Jocelyn Benson being Secretary of State saying, we're not going to know the results in Michigan on election day. It's going to take us 2 weeks to count ballots. And then James is the one that went up there and being like, well, if, Florida can count their ballots on election day, why can't Michigan? Right? And then, of course, Gretchen Whitmer, where do we even start with that woman? It wasn't even my job to cover her, but the stories that I read coming out of Michigan, I was like, if you were thinking of a Disney villain, this is who I think that's who Gretchen Whitmer would be, right? I think she was pretty sad that she didn't get the VP going back, right? Like, she completely shut down the state during COVID, had a lot of pushback from freedom-loving, again, I see them as freedom-loving, common-sense Americans in her state. Then Trump went ahead and called her that woman. She used that to cement her national brand, release a book, basically how I saw it and how my colleagues saw it, particularly because he was there on the ground, like, audition for VP, and then, like, smile through the sadness when she realized she wasn't going to be the VP nominee, and then, still parade around Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, as if they were going to be the saviors and the end-all be-all, and that they were going to save Michigan. And then, doing things like bringing Lizzo to Detroit when 2 weeks before that, Trump was like, if Kamala gets into office, the whole country is going to be like Detroit. And, my coworker that has lived in Detroit for 20 years is like, I don't want the entire country to be like Detroit. Because he has seen the ins and outs and told the stories of that place. But all that goes to show, like, this is the kind of reporting that we were able to bring as a team. And so, again, when you talk about impact, I think that was able to balance out the coverage of the traditional media, of the mainstream media. And, I was making TikToks of being like, the mainstream media sucks. And people would be like, you work for the mainstream media. And I'm like, no, I don't. Like, sorry, this is show and tell time now. The New York Post is the only mainstream media outlet that endorsed Donald Trump for president. But this is what happened a couple weeks before the election, right? And then again, everybody else in the mainstream media had a meltdown, because the New York Times and, the Washington Post and places like that, refused to endorse, which I think again speaks more about the fact of how terrible Kamala Harris would have been for the entire country, that even they could not bring themselves to endorse her. But before that, I was unfortunately not in the print edition that day. So here's two publications where I was a co-author on the cover story. This is something that I'm never going to be able to do ever again in my life. But like, this is pretty cool, right? So this is how the New York Post was able to speak truth to power, and tell the truth about Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and everything that America would have faced under them. So this one was the day that Kamala Harris unveiled her, what is it, 7 trillion? Ooh. Sorry. I'm trying to record this so I can make, like, clips of it and stuff. Hold on. I don't know where that fell off. Oh, it's right here. Hold on, guys. Sorry, one sec. Yeah. I'm recording other people for 6 months, and I try to do it for myself, and it doesn't really work. So anyways, so this is the storytelling that we did at the New York Post, right? And unfortunately I can't, take credit for our great puns or our great cover art. And, for all the different things that I experienced being a part of a team that is as cool and historic as the New York Post is, especially from somebody that basically came from running their own publication and being able to put up whatever they want, however they wanted, whenever they wanted. This was a change, but some of that change was very good, and this is a perfect example of that. So again, this is communism. I think you guys saw this. This went super viral on Twitter. I hope to frame this in my apartment and hopefully one day to be house. But obviously that's the main headline there. And then the sub-headline is Harris unveils budget-breaking $1.7 trillion economic plan that includes government price controls. And for those of you that don't know anything about me or my background, this was a very special story to be a part of for myself because I am half Russian, half Ukrainian. I was born in Moscow, Russia. I'm a proud first-generation American. And, the reasons that I believe in freedom and liberty are because this is what my family chose not to live under. By the time I was born, obviously the Soviet Union fell apart, but it is my family is no strangers to what happens when government has way too much control. But so again, this page right here, this was, of course I can't even read it. Okay, this was Friday, October 25th, so this was about 2 weeks or a week and a half before Election Day. This story was August. So this was August, right? So that was August. And then this was August 17th. And this was Wednesday, August 7th. This was the day that Kamala Harris selected Tim Walz to be her vice presidential nominee. Yeah, so I just love this because it goes, Kamala's ad-lib, Veep nod for Minnesota Gov Walz makes most radical ticket in history out of left field. In a surprise move, Kamala Harris yesterday chose not a moderate but a progressive Tim Walz of Minnesota to be her running mate, creating the most far-left ticket ever. So, before we formally endorsed Donald Trump, we were telling the truth about what a Kamala Harris presidency would mean for America. And this day was very special. So I was actually in Philadelphia this day. And again, this is where I got to experience the strength of our team. Because I was actually there. I was not sent there to cover this event because despite the fact that this was the main story of the day that everybody in the media was talking about, there was also a second story, which was that J.D. Vance had been chosen as the nominee. I don't know how many of you guys went to the RNC. Anybody here? But obviously you guys remember that, how historic that was, because that was just a couple of days after Butler. But, Vance was basically, running his repetition rounds, because when Vance became the vice presidential nominee, not a lot of people knew about him, and he really kind of had to prove himself. Again, in the media, we seek truth and report it. I will truthfully tell you, a lot of people were unsure about him as the nominee. He drew crowds in August, nowhere near the size of Trump crowds. He did have some kind of half-empty events, right? But as more and more people got to know J.D. Vance, they started coming up and showing up to his events at the size, packing, obviously not massive arenas like Trump does, because I think that is a skill that only he knows how to do, but he really proved to the people what he brought to the table. But so on this day, I was one of 5 New York Post reporters who we had in Pennsylvania. And that to me shows the strength of what the New York Post does, is because we want to tell the complete story, the entire story. And so I was one of 2 people who we had at the Vance event. And the way that these events work, right, is this is just some of the events that I've been to over the past 6 months. Press passes. There's about 2 dozen of them. And then there's even this one, because I think the Trump campaign got a little lazy, or maybe they couldn't print them fast enough for us. Because...
You kept that one.
Yeah. No, because this just goes to show. But honestly, I think it's because Vance and Trump ended up doing 3 or 4 events a day the last week of the campaign, so I think they maybe just didn't have enough time to print it, or ran out of the materials or something. But so anyways, what we saw there was we had the Vance event and then we had the Harris event. So for that event, because I was coming from the Vance event, which was earlier that day, I was outside talking to people, interviewing them, and a cover that I do not have because I could not buy it here the day that we released it, which I think is a good sign, but I'm still trying to get my hands on a physical copy. It was actually a story that we ran, I want to say like mid-August, early September, which was reporting from about half of the swing state team, which was we asked Kamala Harris supporters what they thought she stood for, and they couldn't name like a single thing. But so we were outside the event, right? We had two reporters inside the event.
Since we're Brett, how about that?
Yes, brought summer, man. This was a long but very short campaign season if you think about it. Like, I forgot that happened because of how much happened in the past 6 months. But so, we were interviewing them, trying to figure out like why people were turning out. So that was part of the story that we were covering. Then of course there was the speech itself. So we had two reporters in the room that day, one actually in the press pen, one going and talking to all the people that were in the room. And then we had another reporter, Stephen Nelson, who's the DC bureau chief for the Post. He was actually flying in on Air Force Two with Vice President Harris. That, I think, is how you cover a political event. Because what happens when you have one of these badges is you have to show up about 5 or 6 hours before, and then you get put in the press pen, and that is the only part of the story that you get to tell. But when you have such a large team, is you actually get to tell all about all of those different elements of the story. And I think they all make the most complete story. So yeah, that was the day that like I said, Kamala picked Tim Walz. And so fast forward, like we were talking to people, figuring out why they actually supported her. And like, I mean, I think as we've seen afterwards, is nobody that wasn't like being paid or being having DNC talking points shoved down their throat actually knew what she stood for. And so when you talk about what we perceive as the reality on social media and then what we actually see when we go out in the field and get out of these bubbles, whether that's DC or New York, is we get a completely different story. And so that, I think, like, goes to show the impact of proper storytelling when it's done right. And I think that's a good segue to say, like, covering Trump rallies the way that we did was similar, but we usually had at least two reporters on a Trump rally. So we had one person watching the live stream and we had another person on the ground. And so, being the swing state reporter, I was on the ground, like I said, doing a lot of the similar stuff. But, like, to me, what Trump himself says at a Trump rally is about 30% of the story. Because what's usually not captured on the live stream is, for example, the pre-show speakers. So, I'm trying to find this one. Hold on. We have, here it is. Salem, Virginia, November 2nd. This was a couple days before Election Day. To tell you the truth, I thought we were going to flip Virginia red. But I'll tell you why. It's because in the pre-show of Trump's Salem rally, we had Congressman Morgan Griffiths from the 9th district, as my friend Steven Statzer, for those of you that know him, would call it, the 9th. And down in the 9th, it's obviously a very red district. But, for example, Congressman Griffiths showed that they saw about I'm trying to remember the exact number. Of course, I should have pulled it for you guys. But there was basically a large contingent that they saw in people that had voted early, who, of course, in Virginia, we don't have party registration. So these are people that they had identified to be Republican early voters, who had not voted in 2020 or 2016 were coming out. And, of course, if you guys remember what happened in the Youngkin election in 2021, is that basically the power of Southwest Virginia and how red it is, part of the reason he won is because he was able to counteract everybody that lives around us by getting them to vote in droves and getting the kinds of people out of the woodwork that don't care about politics or hadn't cared about politics in 20, 25 years. Or I think as we'll really look to see it, kind of look backward on it for like probably the majority of the rest of our lives, like in a generation, right? Like people are saying, this is the closest a Republican, this is the most popular votes that a Republican has ever gotten. And in the Electoral College, this is the best that a Republican has done since, I believe, Ronald Reagan. So to have that kind of once-in-a-generation turnout and impact, those are the kind of factors that we want to be looking at, is turnout in deep red areas of people saying they're fed up with what's happening here in D.C. all around us, and they're going to go out and they're going to make their voices heard. And, excuse me, and, you know, this is something that Trump talked about day in and day out on the campaign trail. Was too big to rig. We want to make it so big that there is no doubts that we're basically done on election day. And, you know, there's still some funny business going on here and there. Pennsylvania, Jonathan can tell you more about that. But, like, everybody was saying in the weeks leading up to the election, if you talk to anybody in mainstream media, it all comes down to Pennsylvania, right? They're spending bajillions of dollars on TV, whether that was Trump-Harris, whether that was super PACs, whether that was the McCormick-Casey race. It all comes down to Pennsylvania. And honestly, like, that was a pretty fair guess. And so now we see that it actually doesn't matter what happened in Pennsylvania, because the result, right, like what we saw the result at the end of the day is Trump won every single swing state. So it didn't have to come down to Pennsylvania. So, just a little food for thought there. But, again, like, I think what we were there to do was to tell the stories that nobody else in the mainstream media was talking about. So, I pulled a list of course, it's coming up here. I pulled a list of the 6 most impactful stories that I believe I had a chance to tell during my time at the New York Post in the past 6 months. So, let's see, number 1. Let's start with Pennsylvania. So, Bob Casey, soon to be, hopefully, former Senator Bob Casey. Unlike, I'd say, many Democrats who I had the chance of interacting with this cycle, he actually made himself available to media. At least the day that I decided to go to Philadelphia, so, at least lucky me, right? And, it was actually funny because some other people at the New York Post had ran a story about the, fentanyl stocks that he had invested in. And so a lot of Casey people were avoiding talking to members of the media, and it was interesting because they thought that we were actually the ones that had ran that story, but it was actually the Philadelphia Inquirer that, it was that story that picked up steam, and so we were kind of the second people to run it. But this day, I was able to ask Senator Casey about Kamala Harris's position on fracking, because that's a very important issue in Pennsylvania, energy, there was thousands of Pennsylvania energy workers that would have potentially been negatively impacted if the first Biden-Harris and Harris-Walz ticket was elected into office. These people were facing really the end of their livelihoods. And so Casey, he was able to kind of differentiate, at least in the statement that I had from him. I'm going to pull it up right here. So here's what Bob Casey told me that day. He said, "It's clear to me that she has a position that would ensure we don't have fracking bans like some have proposed in Congress. I've always opposed and would continue to oppose," the senator added. So, of course, this was one of the key issues that we had to catch Kamala Harris flip-flopping on because it was such a key campaign issue. And so, the article goes on to say, last month, Harris's campaign claimed that she is no longer in favor of banning fracking, a major policy reversal. Prior to becoming the Democrat presidential nominee, she adamantly opposed it, telling CNN, "There is no question I'm in favor of banning fracking." And 85% of Pennsylvania voters, polling showed, supported more domestic oil and gas production. And this was actually an ad that the Dave McCormick campaign was at the time running against Bob Casey, saying Harris was telling a TV interviewer that the fossil fuel industries should, quote, have an ability to transition, end quote, should the fracking ban she once favored take place. And the very interesting thing was that after that, a Kamala Harris campaign spokesperson went on TV, I think it was Meet the Press or CNBC, some major national network, and they actually said that she would in fact be able to ban fracking and that she would be in favor of it. So the campaign spokespeople were not aligned with what Kamala Harris herself was saying. And this is why it's important to have media that it does not drink the mainstream media Kool-Aid, because you are able to call them out like that. So, that's just one example. Another one, let's do an example here in Virginia. I'm sure if you guys were like me, any day that I was home, I was watching Real Housewives because I did not want to think about anything related to the campaign. Yet still, through streaming, I got ads about Eugene Vidman and Derek Anderson. Which that's another question because we don't live in the 7th, so whoever was doing media buys on that race needed to do a little bit of a better job. But the thing is that Eugene Vidman is a classic example of the mainstream media drinking the Kool-Aid, right? Like, they took him and portrayed him to be this anti-Trump hero. And in this election where Donald Trump was running, that was supposed to be his ticket to the top. And so it was myself and I think one other reporter at the Washington Free Beacon that actually dove into Eugene Vidman, what his brother was doing. His brother ran a PAC that was supporting his reelection. If any of you guys know anything about PAC law and the way that PACs work, you're not supposed to be coordinating with the person that's running your PAC. Now, of course, it happens, but this is like a glaring example because they were still pictured at events together. Speaking of Substack, Alexander Vidman has a Substack, and he has he's putting up interviews on there, and his brother was in the interviews. So this was like very obviously in public, glaring red flag that this was going on. So a very interesting part of that is that Eugene Vidman actually, when he entered the race for the 7th district, he did a very good job of talking to the media, local media, particularly in Prince William County. He announced in last December when he was first running for Congress that he had a business, and it was an LLC that he founded. Interestingly enough, this business had the exact same P.O. box as where his campaign P.O. box was, and he and his brother are both on the business together. But it was called Trident Support LLC, and their purpose was to bring Ukraine technology to aid the country as it continues to fight Russian invasion. And he told the Prince William Times at that time that he had made 14 trips to Eastern Europe, to Ukraine, through the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, which is a State Department funded group. So he took 14 taxpayer funded trips, then went to start a business off of it. And another element of that was that he, of course, when you run for office, you have to file financial disclosures with the clerk of the House of the U.S. House of Representatives. And so through looking at his financial disclosures, we found that he made, I think it was 5 times as much money in the first 2 months of 2024 as he had made in the entire previous year. So, of course, this is kind of the difference between news and opinion, is we just raise these issues and people come back and they answer them. So, this got comments like, let's see, what was a good one? So this was the question that was raised in my mind. Have they registered as representing a foreign government yet? They have been doing it for years. Here's another part of the story, which was Alexander, a retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel, bought a $1.9 million house in Florida in 2023, right after they started the business. Vidman refused to answer questions from the media, not only from conservative media, but also from mainstream media. I don't know if you guys saw, he did an interview a couple of days before the election where he actually didn't even know the district that he was running in. Right? And so, now that I'm about to be out of the straight news business, I'm going to be writing some op-eds soon of, we as Virginians need to hold Eugene Vidman accountable because the media tried to hold him accountable. He actually agreed to do a couple of interviews, and those went so terribly for him. But basically what happened in that situation was that, it was basically, I think, too close to the actual election to make an impact. Let's see what else is in this story. Here we go. This comment reminds me of it. I'm rolling. The bit about flexing their influence. Lieutenant colonels flex in gyms and parade field. A CSS boy can't find the gym. I don't really know what that means, but this other part was interesting because the Vidman brothers had made trips to the White House to meet with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan right around the time when they were starting this business, right? And so, again, this is an example of us telling the stories that nobody else was going to tell. This is why to me, it's so important to tell these stories that the rest of the mainstream media ignores because they just thought that he was all rainbows and sunshine and didn't even, part of the story was that he wouldn't answer the questions, but they didn't even warrant or think that it warranted digging into his financial disclosures, which are very much public information, especially if you're running for office. Let's see, another one. So this was another one. So of course Butler, we all know what happened there. But I co-wrote a story interviewing one of the neighbors whose property is backed up to the Butler Fairgrounds the day of the Trump rally. And I believe that it was my reporting, in part. Of course, lots of the media, or many members of the media, started to dig into this after some of the stories that we published at the Post. But basically, leading to the resignation of the Secret Service director. But the story that I wrote was Secret Service blames local police, saying they were tasked with securing property surrounding Trump's Pennsylvania rally. How many of you guys have ever been to a Trump rally? Okay, you guys know who's in charge of all the security, right? It's the Secret Service. It's the Secret Service. Again, having been to like 24 Trump rallies, and I think my first Trump rally I ever went to was 2018. Like, that the Secret Service is the head honcho. They direct all of the local law enforcement partners on what to do. They tell them where to shut off the highway and when. But the Secret Service is in charge. And for some reason, on this day, they were not. And it was reporting that I did, and I know at least this one neighbor, she only talked to me and one other media outlet. We were able to get a picture of, I don't know if you guys can see this, right, but these are gates that were on the Butler County Farm Show grounds. So it is basically a gap in the chain link fence that anybody could have come up to. This was right off her property. But so this is why the work of the media, again, is so important, because the media will go and tell you that, well, the Secret Service, their job is to protect the president and presidential candidates, so of course they do a great job. And it's like, no, if you actually look into it, they didn't. And, like I said, I think that story is one of many that then followed suit that, of course, ultimately led to the resignation of the director. And, I will tell you firsthand that there was much more security at these events after that event happened. Another thing that I got to do when I was on the campaign trail, and I will credit my editor for this. So she used to be the opinions editor of the New York Post before she took on our job as the swing state team and overseeing all of us running around all across the country. I swear to God, I don't think that woman slept more than 3 hours a night in the past 6 months, which, more credit to her, because I'm usually in bed by about 10 o'clock, and she was still up editing stories at 3 in the morning. So she did amazing work, but one of the questions that she always had us ask is, we're sending you to X thing to cover an event. What other story can you get when you're there? Because, again, this is the question that the rest of the media doesn't ask. And, I had the great fortune for a couple of days of traveling in the press pool with J.D. Vance on Trump Force 2. Again, super cool experience, but, you don't get to tell the full story when you're there, because when you travel in the press pool, especially if you're back-to-back events, you're only there when he's there, so you don't get to tell any of the surrounding stories. So even though that was a very cool once-in-a-lifetime experience, I was in the press pool during the date of the first Trump-Harris debate, and then we went to New York for 9/11, which, again, very cool experience. But outside of that, when you're traveling on that plane, you don't get to tell the rest of the stories that are there. And so this story here is a perfect example of that. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina. There's a Charlotte suburb called Gastonia, if any of you guys have been there. And as I kind of learned through my travels, is that this was this kind of Republican hotbed. So the Faith and Freedom group that's down there is out of there, and the guy used to be on the Gaston County commission. Before he went to go run that group, he was one of the youngest elected members of the county commission. Michael Watley is from Gaston County. And so, there's all these ties to these big Republican power players in this one county, the Charlotte suburb, that nobody really talks about, right? So this is very cool. You guys have all been to county GOP offices, right? So this one was set up in a shopping mall, in a retail center. This is very cool. So this is how they funded their party operations, is by selling merch in their local mall. And I got to interview these two young guys. One of them is he's been active in like Republican politics there since he was like 12. And then another one, he actually goes to college at Liberty, now Liberty Law School. But he was there for the summer working as a Trump Force 47 captain. So that was super cool. And I ran this story in July, which I think means that I was really ahead of the curve. And what a lot of the mainstream media is realizing now is that, younger voters, particularly younger men, but I think women are kind of catching up, we're going to turn towards the president. But to me, telling this story was being a part of that narrative way earlier than anybody else was, because I was asked to see what other story could be told. And then, finally, okay, two more. So you guys all remember from the Trump-Harris debate, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs.
Oh yeah, the famous.
So yes, we all saw the memes. We saw the memes and everything that was made out of it, right? I know I saw it on all my social media whenever I'd opened it for probably a good 2 weeks after that happened. So this was cool. I got to interview J.D. Vance on Trump Force 2 the 2 days after that happened, because of course that was his home state, was Ohio. Springfield, I think, is about 2.5 hours from Cincinnati where he lives. And I got to ask him about that. And a very interesting thing that I learned from that conversation was that actually he had been aware of the migrant crisis in Springfield, and he, the way that you raise an issue in Congress, which is, those of you that work in Congress will know, is you write a letter, that gets put into the congressional record, and that's kind of your first step in raising awareness to things that you see going on in your town. And so this Springfield city manager, who had kind of become the center of this whole story after the election, and, the ABC and David Muir being like, well, there's no shady things going on in Springfield, is that I believe it was in July, so this was in October when we ran the story, September, obviously, when it was raised during the debate, but in July, before Vance became the vice presidential nominee, back when he, maybe he was in some, behind-the-scenes conversations, but basically, there was no immediate impact on the race in him doing this. He was just, serving the people of Ohio, as he should be, as their United States Senator, is he actually raised this issue, but the rest of the mainstream media did not pay attention to it before it was raised in this debate. And so we were able to go back and pull that letter from the congressional record and say, actually, J.D. Vance has known about this, and he tried to do things, and nobody in D.C. would do anything. And now you're saying that there is no problem, but these people have had an influx of migrants where there was 20,000 of them in a community of 60,000, and now that it's become this viral thing, now everybody cares, and now all the media is looking. But when he tried to raise that issue, nobody else wanted to pay attention. And so again, that is a story that at that moment nobody else in the media had, and I don't think that was really widely reported anywhere, that J.D. Vance actually tried to fix this issue 3 months before it became this, national firestorm. And, ending on my favorite, so you guys know that, part of my origin story in conservative politics is, Second Amendment issues. So I was able to write this story, which went semi-viral. I think I got about 360,000 hits on Twitter, which was for me, my account was 2,000 followers, so to me that was pretty viral. It was retweeted by a lot of groups and people on influencers and things in the Second Amendment space. But this was a story that mobilizing apathetic hunters and gun owners could be key to conservative victories in November. And so I'm not Nostradamus, but I think I kind of predicted that when people who grew up with their Second Amendment rights see their rights being trampled on, they're going to do something about it. And so I was able to showcase this study from this group called Vote for America, and they discovered that 10 million hunters and gun owners in the U.S. were not registered to vote, and their whole effort was getting hunters and gun owners registered to vote. If you guys saw, Elon Musk's work with America PAC and things like that, that was actually one of the questions that they focused on, but this was actually one of my first stories that I ran for the Post back in July. So I was able to identify and kind of amplify this issue, again, before a lot of other people caught on to it, which I thought was very cool. And obviously with people like, Don Jr. being very active in the hunters and sportsmen community, that became, I think, a much bigger issue for the Trump campaign, going down to the wire and saying, I will protect your Second Amendment He's already come out and said he wants to do national concealed carry reciprocity, which I personally think is super awesome. But we were actually able to focus in on some specific data in swing states. And so they found 500,000 in Pennsylvania, hunters and gun owners who weren't registered to vote, and around 370,000 in Michigan, North Carolina. Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Missouri all had more than 500,000 hunters and gun owners unregistered, and Arizona had the smallest shortfall, which was 133,000. But, when you look at elections, and I think in Virginia we are no strangers to very tight elections, when you get people out that, of course they care about other issues, but when you hit this as their top button issue and you say go out to vote, or this thing in your life that you care about extremely significantly will change, these are the margins that win elections. And so identifying these issues that, of course, the big national issues were economy and immigration, right? But when you identify these particular things that say this is actually what will have an impact on your life, these are the conversations, again, going back to kind of what we all know, right? Like door knocking and these conversations that change minds. When you reach certain communities and you get this message out to them, that's where we can make an impact. And I think at the end of the day, that is where we can see where that impact is made. So I think that's it that I had. I will open it up for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, go for it, Danielle.
Victoria, keeping your journal for a little bit, but, kind of paring it back to have it where there was a statistic that came out from the writing recently that said between this election cycle and Trump's first cycle running for office, the number of people reading conservative news outlets like Drudge, maybe not all the other conservative outlets like that, conservative news site, has dropped dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that is due to? And does it have anything, you think, to do with Trump being more focused on outlets like Fox News this cycle?
So it's interesting. I have a couple thoughts, and this is actually kind of some internal conversations that I've been having as I think about what I want to do next in my life and my career. One, I think when you look at our generation, we don't read. Can we talk about that, right? We don't read. We get our news from other sources. We get it from TikTok, from Instagram, from Twitter. And again, maybe in this bubble of us, we do. And maybe in the greater Washington, D.C. region, we consume more news than the average American. But as a whole, I think our generation doesn't read. I think as people that read die off, that is probably part of it. But I actually did an appearance on a podcast. You guys remember Katie Gorka? She's chairman of the Fairfax GOP. She's got her own podcast called the Happy Women Podcast. I have two fun facts about that. So I was actually their first ever repeat guest, which was super fun. And I actually got to go on the podcast before Sebastian by about a week and a half. So I felt very cool about that because when I listened to their episode with Seb, they said, well, Seb, we thought you were going to be our first guest, and then we thought you were going to be our first male guest, and I got to beat Seb by about 2 weeks, so I was like, wow, I have made it. Screw writing for the New York Post, writing cover stories, I got to beat Sebastian Gorka's appearance on his wife's own podcast. But when I was talking on that podcast, the second time that I did it, we talked about the impact that non-traditional media has. Because and I was actually going to start off with this question, but two quick questions for you guys as a group. What is the difference between news and opinion?
News is what happens, opinion is what people interpret.
So,
Facts for news.
you think facts?
Is how you feel about it.
So, what if I told you that my new view is that all news is opinion? You believe it?
Yes.
So here's why. So if you don't agree with that, let me convince you why in a couple of points. So at a publication like the New York Post, my name is the one that goes on the article, or one of my coworkers, but there's about 7 or 8 hands that touch that piece before it ends up in publication, whether that's on web, in print. So it is the opinions of 8 people that made up the final product that you get. To me, this again was new because I basically went from putting whatever I wanted on the internet to an audience of 30 to 40,000. But I guess when you reach, and I looked at the number today, I had 1.32 million people read my stories over the past 6 months, for a total of 202 million views. So I guess when you have that kind of eyeballs on your work, there's the opinion of multiple people that go in to produce it. But let me just walk you through the stages of a story and how it ends up in a format like that, right? So for example, let's say a couple of different examples. So one, it could be a pitch story, right? So a pitch that I get from an organization saying, hey, we're doing X, Y, and Z, come cover it. So I can respond or not respond to that, right? So if I choose to open that email, if I choose to say, hey, I think that's a good story, that's my opinion, right? That's opinion number one. Two is saying, hey, I'm going to pitch it to my editor. Their decision of that story, yay or nay, right? Am I covering it remotely or am I going in person? That affects the kind of story that goes in there. I could go to a story, go to an event, write a story, and it not end up. That was the opinion of the editor that nixed that piece, or, a majority rule in an editorial meeting, that chose that story not to run or completely reformatted. Again, we have stories that ran on web versus in print. It is an opinion of somebody to choose that to add a certain headline. So news as we know it at a publication like this is a collection of multiple people's opinions. And again, in a story, I could write it just based off of what an organization says. I could get multiple other expert opinions. That is all a collection of opinions. When I go to cover an event and I sit there in these press pens with, journalists from MSNBC, ABC, NBC, all of my colleagues in quote unquote big media, right? For some reason, I see them a third of the way through a speech. They've all got the exact same headline written on their screens. That is because it was their opinion that they wanted to go into that event and pick out the most radical thing that Trump said, and that was going to be the story about the event, right? That is their opinion that then gets published on the internet. I like to do my news writing as kind of more of an analysis-based process, so I want to listen to the whole hour and a half speech. But then, again, if I'm working on somebody else with the story, we'll go between ourselves. What did we think was the most important? And I'll also go, well, here's the story that everybody else is going to write about it. Here's the story that we're going to write about it. But again, that is a collection of multiple opinions. And so that is the way that at least in my experience, the corporate media, the mainstream media works. Now, on the opposite effect, but, outside of my writing, I also did podcasts and things like that, appearances, and it always pained me as a journalist if I had whether it was a 15-minute conversation or an hour and a half conversation, I had to pick out one or two quotes of what they said. And so now that I was interviewed as much as I was the interviewee, I know that when I go on to a show and do an appearance, I think everything I say is important. And so in the mainstream media, we have kind of ordained ourselves as these arbiters of truth for one reason or another. But at the end of the day, it is just a collection of opinions. And so when we look at non-traditional media, for example, podcasts, I think was one way, that we were able to, I think particularly in the case of J.D. Vance, that America was able to get to know him. That is obviously a less filtered way of consuming the media. And you go, well, who wants to sit through an interview of J.D. Vance, right? And then you go Joe Rogan, on the Trump interview, I remember looking at it at one point and he reached an audience of 65 million. So I feel pretty good with my 2.2 million, but 65 million is, I think, just show that the mainstream media's diluted version of what is put on a page or put on a web page is so different. And so this perception, for example, that existed around J.D. Vance is, right, Tim Walz called him weird. Again, who made Tim Walz the arbiter of weird? But, at the end of the day, through podcasts, whether that was Theo Vaughn or Nelk Boys or Joe Rogan, people got to know that J.D. Vance is actually a really cool guy that I want to have a beer with, and maybe he should, have a chance of being our next vice president. And so when you take a new platform, I think that's where people are going to go to read their news, because nobody wanted to cover J.D. Vance favorably except all these podcasters were like, heck yeah, he might be the next vice president of the United States. Of course I want to have him on my show. And so through that we were able to, and, I didn't even talk about, talking about opinion. Maybe I will write a 1,600 word story, but I need to fill 400 words for print, or I need to put 800 words on a website. And so that all, again, gets whittled down by other people's opinions. So it is a collection of opinions, again, which is what you see. And so I think, kind of to answer your question, is like, new media is taking over. And so I think realistically, like, print is dead, print is dying. Maybe print is changing, like at the New York Post is changing. I know in the future they're planning to get into podcasts. We had a pretty large operation on video. That clips of that interview that I did with Vance on Trump Force 2, I think, again, I looked at one point and it had like 350,000 views, right? That's probably about 10 times more than the amount of people that saw that particular story, but that was a completely new way to reach new audiences that aren't going to download the New York Post app. They're not going to spend, what is it these days, like $3 on a newspaper at Giant, and they're going to get their news in a completely different way. And so I think for any kind of media to survive, they need to absorb these new media forms. And so going back to the podcast appearance that I did, it was a podcast of talking about a podcast. It was around the frame of my reporting, but I wasn't really, in that regard, I wasn't talking about, I've been on way too many airplanes like this in the past 6 months. I wasn't really talking about my actual reporting. I was talking about the perception that people had, and that had come from mainly not the mainstream media. And so again, I think, like, one thing that I'm looking to do, as I mentioned, I've created my own Substack because I want to have another property that I own and where you can go and find the work that I consider to be important. And so, maybe I'll continue to pitch X, Y, and Z things to an editor, but if it gets shut down and I still think it's an important story, that's where that story is going to live, because I think it should have a place to live. I think that's a very roundabout way of answering your question. Any other questions?
Thank you, Victoria.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Really good to hear about what you've been doing.
Thanks.
So really appreciate it.
Thanks.
It's good to have members of our club and alumni of our club doing amazing things like what Victoria has been doing and is doing. While Victoria just a couple minutes of business to handle. Who does not have a copy of the amended bylaws? Who is a dues-paying member of the club? Who has your hands up and doesn't have a copy of the bylaws? Thank you, Brad.
Alright. I have a full time here to assist because